Hello there. Coming to you live from the bunker. This is episode 28 of Watchtower in Focus, the show that zooms in on all things JW, bringing the governing body and its teachings and policies under microscopic scrutiny. On Thursday, October 3rd, a jury of 12 in Arkansas convicted former Jehovah's Witness Elder Roderick Watkins of 4 counts of felony sexual assault of minors. As some of his victims attending the courtroom looked on, Watkins received from the jury the maximum possible 20-year sentence for each of the 4 counts, totaling 80 years. With testimony concerning 7 victims heard in this trial alone, and with stories of more victims in other states, Watkins is arguably the most prolific sex offender in Jehovah's Witness history. Present in the courtroom was my ever-present co-host, Mark O'Donnell, who occasionally refers to himself as John Redwood. And also joining us for this special live stream is Telltale, who is going to let us call him Owen on this live stream. So Owen and Mark, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Glad to be here.
Great to be here. Unfortunately, we're again talking about a very sensitive and unfortunate subject, but the good news is that justice was served, and we've got some other news later in the program that we're going to disclose regarding another case, which is also a sign that justice has been served. So thank you, Lloyd, for putting this together.
No problem. It's nice to see already, let's see, wow, 265 watching on. So clearly a lot of people who are interested to know, Mark, what it was like to be there in Arkansas to see these events unfold. Tamara Hesseltine there saying, can't wait to see justice finally come. So perhaps, Mark, you could take us through take us through the case. What was it like, and what was the mood in the courtroom?
It was a very somber mood. This is not a joking matter by any means, and I think that's kind of an understatement to say that. But maybe I could back up and say, for those that haven't had a chance to read the article on JW Survey, several months back, I produced an article about the case of Roderick Watkins, who was arrested in November of 2018 on multiple counts of felony child sexual abuse. And I have the charging documents here that Detective Jennifer Osborne of the Cleburne County, Arkansas law enforcement agency. She was the arresting officer and the one who had actually spent all of the time investigating this case. So to give you a little bit of an idea of a timeline, this defendant named Roderick Watkins came to Heber Springs, Arkansas from Indiana around the year 2000, and many of the victims whom he later abused were not even born when he moved to Heber Springs, Arkansas. And
we're talking about victims who were all victimized in the 21st century.
Yes. So we're going to get into a little bit later about what happened prior to his going to Heber Springs, Arkansas. And I think it's important to point out that a man like this, a serial pedophile, a serial child molester, does not just start molesting children in the middle of his life. This is a pattern of behavior that starts at a very young age. And in the case of Mr. Watkins, that's exactly what happened. And we have evidence that we're still investigating from other states. So let me just, maybe I can just give the audience a broad perspective on who this man is. Roderick Watkins is from North Carolina. Mm-hmm. He was a Jehovah's Witness who was approved to be a Watchtower Bethelite around the early 1980s. I think it was around 1983 that he was assigned to Bethel. He served as a waiter in Bethel, and he was there for several years before he met his wife, Becky Watkins. Now, his wife's sister was a housekeeper at Brooklyn Bethel. She introduced him to Rod. She introduced him to, that's correct, to Rod Watkins. They ended up getting married and spending about 2.5 years in Brooklyn Bethel. And in 1988, he was dismissed from Bethel under dubious circumstances. He was kicked out, is the vernacular way to put it. And no one really knew why he was kicked out of Bethel. I have been contacted by relatives of his in North Carolina, and even they were not aware of why he was kicked out of Bethel in 1988.
But not disfellowshipped or anything like that?
That's great. It's a great question, too. So at the time, he was not disfellowshipped, and we'll learn later, and we'll discuss it a little bit, that he was kicked out for homosexuality, and he admittedly had a homosexual experience where he was on a camping trip in upstate New York, and he admitted to sexually touching a young 20 to 21-year-old Bethelite. Watkins apparently went to the Bethel elders and admitted what he did. He was immediately dismissed from Bethel. And what we know about him, there's still a few pieces that we're putting together, was that according to his testimony and the testimony of his wife, they were sent into the field. So here's a man who was a ministerial servant while he was at Bethel and married. He was ejected from Bethel for homosexuality, and then he was sent into the field. We know that he lived in Missouri, in Sedalia, Missouri, and we have evidence that he may have lived in Kansas City, Missouri. And then by the early 1990s, around 1991, he had become an elder. And now, remind you, he was dismissed in 1988 from Brooklyn Bethel, and he became an elder just a few years later after having touched this young man who was not a minor, according to our records, but he was an adult Bethelite, about 20 to 21 years of age. And within 3 years, this man, who was known to be extremely charismatic, was appointed as an elder in a congregation in Indiana, and he may have been actually appointed sooner than that. We're still trying to piece together those details. But he was an elder in Indiana and was so respected by the congregation in West Lawrenceburg, Indiana, which is right on the Ohio border, that he was assigned with his wife to live inside of the Kingdom Hall apartment in that congregation in Indiana. So here's a man who's living in the apartment. He's an elder. He's a pioneer. He's the service overseer of the congregation. And for any that are not familiar, if you're an elder and you're a pioneer, you're almost always assigned to be the service overseer, which is one of the 3 coordinating elders of a congregation. So he had a lot of power and authority. Those are the elders that form judicial committees and control just about every aspect of the congregation. So he was there from around 1991 until the year 2000. And in the year 2000, Watchtower issued a letter to all bodies of elders in which they stated that anyone who is not a special full-time representative of the organization, meaning a special pioneer or a circuit overseer or a missionary or a few other positions, would not qualify to live inside of a Kingdom Hall apartment. And this was the reason that Becky Watkins on the witness stand stated that they left Indiana and moved to her hometown of Arkansaw. And she's, I believe, from Mountain View, Arkansas. But they ultimately,
Becky is his wife, right?
Yeah, Becky Watkins is Rod Watkins' wife. right? And they met through her sister. So it's sort of coming full circle for her. She marries a man from North Carolina. They end up going back to where she's from in Arkansas. And this was in the year 2000, right after Watchtower had issued a letter stating they had to move because they weren't a special full-time representative. Although he was a very highly respected elder, he got to Heber Springs. He was assigned all sorts of convention parts. He was in charge of a full costume drama back when we did dramas at the assemblies. Had a lot of children around him at all times. Becky and Rod never had children. The organization was their life. They were pioneers. They were so trusted by members of the congregation that one of the congregation members who was very sick with cancer and had 2 children actually signed over her rights to her children in the event that she died. Rod and his wife would get their children. While she was getting treatments for stage 4 cancer, he molested her son.
I remember that being one of the most shocking revelations from when we first handled this. We first kind of came across this story a few months back. How can you possibly capitalize on that situation? Well, how can you do what he was doing anyway? But to also capitalize on cancer and take advantage of trust in such a perverse way, just absolutely stomach churning.
Yes, this woman who came forward, and I want to just mention that as we get started here, it's very, very important to us at JW Survey and to me in my work not to place the victims or their families in any kind of danger or subject them to any kind of contact from the outside world. These people are suffering. They have been through untold grief because not only of the abuse of their children, but the after effects of the abuse has been horrific. They've lost familial contact with their children. Most of these parents testified that they can't hug their children anymore, that they had behavioral problems, that they were just sickened by what happened. And some of the children became suicidal, cutting themselves, attempted suicide, in one case several times. Severe emotional trauma like you just can't imagine. And one thing I learned about this case was that this man, Rod Watkins, was not a man who physically pinned down a child and raped a child. It wasn't like that. This was a very protracted case of sexual touching that took place over many years with many children, many more than testified at this trial. And there's so much information to unpack here, but we have 4 witnesses who were the ones that the police identified as the ones that they wanted to charge Watkins with these crimes, but they interviewed many more than that. The police detective interviewed at least 10 victims of Roderick Watkins. 4 were charged. Well, I'm sorry, 4 were used in the charge against Watkins because they were the 4 strongest and that was what they needed. There were 3 additional that testified at trial last week, Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. And there were several additional that did not testify. But that's not all. There were accusations against Mr. Watkins in Mountain View congregation, as well as other places, other cities, such as West Lawrenceburg, Indiana, where he had come from. So I'm trying to be very careful what I say here because I want to protect these victims. And I also want to say that there are some unscrupulous individuals who have grabbed pretrial court documents that name members of the family who ended up testifying and the initials of their children and their phone numbers and their addresses and have posted them on the internet. And I've gone to a great deal of trouble to try to protect these victims by redacting their names. You know, it's so insensitive. You cannot imagine the trauma until you sit in that courtroom and you watch these people break down in tears.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I'm interested to know. It's one thing for us to kind of go over the cold, hard facts of the story, and these really are cold. But I'm interested to know emotionally what it was like to sit in that courtroom, because this must have been a monumental moment for many of these victims who are so heavily traumatized by what this man has done to them, and here's their opportunity to see him pay for it.
There was emotion from the moment this got started. There is a process called voir dire where the jury is selected and they're asked a lot of questions, and a jury is selected. In this case, it was a jury, I believe it was 14 plus one alternate. So on the morning of last Wednesday, when the trial started, 8 o'clock in the morning, there was the entire room was filled. You had two sections of seating, left and right. You had 9 chairs in one row, and then you had a center section, and you had another 9 chairs, and then you had a total of 7 rows. So you had 9. So you had 18 times 7 seats, and the entire room was, virtually nowhere else to sit. And that's always the case with a trial like this, because they have a large jury pool. So the emotion really didn't come in until that jury was selected and the rest of the potential jurors were dismissed, and the family members of those who would be testifying started coming in, and they started calling. Well, they began with opening arguments, obviously, and I can discuss a little bit about the opening arguments. But immediately, when the first person to testify was Detective Jennifer Osborne, who spent more than 180 hours researching this case. It's way more than that, but she spent 180 hours plus before she arrested Rod Watkins in November of 2018. And she did a lot more work on this case afterwards as well. And there's more going on with this even beyond this conviction. But the amount of time spent, they called her first as a witness, and she testified. It was actually a very short testimony. It was, did you interview this victim, this victim, this victim, that victim, this family member, that family member? I believe there was a total of 22 subpoenas issued in all to the 7 victims who testified, plus all their family members, plus a neighbor who lived where Rod Watkins lived in Heber Springs, which, by the way, was also right next to the Kingdom Hall, a few steps, a few hundred yards. So there was a total of 22 subpoenas issued. Most of those people did testify. And they started by bringing in, one at a time, the victims of Rod Watkins, and most of them are still minors. Only one is in his mid-20s, and he's actually an ex-JW. He was the only one in the group that's a former Jehovah's Witness. And he testified very tearfully about the damage that Mr. Watkins did to him. Now, his abuse took place on 2 distinct occasions that he remembers very clearly. And this was when he had just turned 17. So he was a 16-year-old just turning 17. Watkins was known to have taken children on all sorts of outings, fishing, hiking, sporting events. He's from North Carolina, so he's a big North Carolina sports fan. So he went to this big stadium in Arkansaw with the 16 to 17-year-old victim who testified, the victim's father, and one other man from the congregation. So it was 4 of them, and they were in this giant bowl arena all the way at the very top. And it's typical in those games for the entire crowd to stand the whole time until the first team makes a touchdown, or the home team makes a touchdown, and then they start sitting. So in this particular incident, and I'm trying to be careful how I describe this, but Watkins had sexually assaulted him in public with 3 other people standing right there, because this man knew how to sexually touch a child in public or in mixed company and get away with it. Now, we know ultimately he didn't get away with it, but he got away with it for a while. There was an incident at the football game where in broad daylight, he sexually assaulted for the entire game until the young man was able to get away from Watkins. He saw there were some programs for sale, and he ran down there to get away. And when he came back, his dad was there, and he had the whole row moved down and stood next to his dad. And he was just, he described on the witness stand that he was just in utter shock. He didn't know what to do. And for anyone who's ever been a victim of sexual assault, there's a freeze reflex. Children especially freeze. They don't know what's going on. They don't understand what's going on. They don't know if this is real. Is this an out-of-body experience? Is this really happening to them? How should I react? They don't understand these things. And that's what happened with this young man. He didn't really fully understand.
Accounted for in instructions that are given to children. I'm thinking specifically of the infamous Caleb and Sophia cartoon, where Caleb is told to just say no or whatever. It just assumes that children have that kind of power in that situation to fend off a molester or stop themselves being raped. But as you mentioned there, it really isn't that straightforward.
Not at all. No. And oddly enough, Caleb and Sophia were mentioned several times during the trial by the defense. And that's a whole nother story. I'm going to mention that in my survey article, but I don't want to get into the complexities of that, but that did come up during trial. With this young man who testified first, there was a second incident that occurred during a normal outing. I want to call it an outing. It was a get-together at someone's house in which there was a lot of people around. They were in the kitchen, and this man, Watkins, initiated sexual contact with other people in the room. And I mean, that's how sick and perverted this man is. And that was when this young man who testified, the alarm bells went off. He said, if there was ever a doubt as to what happened at that football game, now I fully understand this is wrong and I've been sexually assaulted. He then spoke to his parents about what happened. I think they went to his grandfather and spoke to him about what happened. It ultimately went to the elders. And what was interesting is that the way that he described going to the elders, it was very, very upsetting for him because they did not want to do anything about this. They wanted to handle it completely internally. In fact, I'm looking for the quote here of what he said. He said that the witnesses have a rule of two. And so then he was asked on the witness stand, well, what do you mean a rule of two? So he went on to describe that this rule of two had to be that, nothing would be handled in the congregation unless you had a second witness to the crime or to the sin, as Watchtower, likes to differentiate, but it is a crime. So just to be clear, this was never reported to the police. And I would also say that he spoke to a member of the congregation. I'm being careful what I say here because I don't want to reveal any names, but he spoke to a member of the congregation who initially didn't believe him and said that Watkins would never do this. You're mistaken, or, you're not really reading it right. You've got the wrong impression about what may have happened or didn't happen. Be careful the accusations that you make. Well, this man who told him that had a young son who ended up coming out a couple years later as one of Watkins' most affected witnesses. This young man was so badly injured that he became suicidal and required hospitalization. He required intense therapy, both with his family and outside of his family unit, one-on-one counseling. He was sent to a special camp. In fact, I mentioned in my JW survey article that there was a GoFundMe account that was trying to raise $100,000. And I think they raised about maybe 30,000 of that, because the amount of money they had to spend to send this child to a camp for persons who were injured in this manner. Well, it was an enormous burden, not only financially, but emotionally. The parents testified of this other young man. And again, I know this is going to sound a little confusing to our audience, because these are abuse victims and survivors, and I cannot mention their names, and I will not mention their names. We have to protect them. They've gone through such incredible turmoil in their lives. But this young man did go to this therapy and is continuously in therapy. And it's going to take years and years and years for him to recover from the abuse. So the first witness.
Can I just ask a question, Mark? That is something that I'm not quite clear on. Did you say that of the 7 victims that the jury heard testimony from, only one was an ex-Jehovah's Witness?
Only one became an ex-Jehovah's Witness. That's correct. So I will also.
I'm interested to know, and maybe I'm completely misunderstanding things, but I'm interested to know the dynamic of 6 Jehovah's Witnesses giving very damning testimony, essentially against the organization. What was going on there?
Well, that's not how they viewed it. It wasn't testimony against the organization. It was testimony against their abuser, Roderick Watkins, who abused his authority. They all testified that he was a very, very important man, that he was a person who had incredible amount of control, charisma, authority in the congregation. It wasn't just that he was a service overseer. It was that this guy was a convention overseer for multiple conventions. He had a full costume drama, which is a very big deal if you're a JW, to have all of these people working under you in a full costume drama. He was a captivating speaker. I can't tell you how many people have contacted me to say what a unbelievably captivating speaker this man was. He wrote letters to people after conventions, thanking them for their service. And he just knew how to manipulate people. He was a master coordinator and manipulator of people. And he had everyone believing he was just the most trustworthy elder in the circuit. And
that's another wrinkle to this, is the fact that he was in a position of power. We were talking about the Caleb and Sophia videos, just telling kids to just say no. And you were saying how they freeze up in those types of situations. That's just another level of damaging when the person is in a position of power over the victim or the survivor,
This is what brought out the tearful testimony from the parents who said that they had signed over their parental rights in the event that they passed away. They gave their parental rights to Mr. Watkins. They all trusted him. They literally threw their kids at him. And I have to say, I'm not even scratching the surface of the number of people who gave their kids to Mr. Watkins. He was alone with them at all times. When he had Bible studies, both in Indiana as well as in Arkansas, it was always understood that no one else was to be around. The wife, Becky Watkins, would always disappear and say, now it's time for me to leave you two alone. We've heard testimony about that. And also privately, there's even a lot that the law enforcement agents don't know about yet. There's even photographs of Watkins placing his hand in a sexual way on a 14-year-old girl that they never even saw. In fact, I received these photographs and detailed information just prior to the trial. And
so Was the wife, Becky, aware of what was happening? When she became aware, if she wasn't, did she testify against him? I feel like you said she did, right?
No, she testified in his defense. And so I have to say this. Look, there's a lot of people complicit in this. There's a lot of enabling that went on. There's a lot of victim blaming that went on. And I'm going to mention about what the defense for this was. But, without saying too much, let's be very clear. The wife in this case allegedly knew what was going on and turned a blind eye to it and denied the accusations. In fact, what happened was back in 2017, she received a phone call from an individual in Indiana who confronted her because of what happened to a young man in Indiana. And like I say, I'm being careful not to give away too much information, but she immediately went into defense mode, denied everything. In fact, she told that person who called that I'm reporting you to the elders for slander. This is what a pedophile and an enabler will do when you have a situation where you've got a man that's got this much control that basically his wife was telling these people, I'm bulletproof. My husband's bulletproof. You're not going to prove this because of who he is. So he was, in 2017, he was deleted as an elder, even after multiple allegations had been made. What was really upsetting to victim number one that testified.
Sorry, could you just clarify why he was deleted?
So that was a little bit fuzzy because it was discussed at trial. So he was deleted in 2017 and he was disfellowshipped in 2018. The real reasons for those things are obviously only known to the elders and to Watchtower because they kept records of all of this. But one of the things that even his wife testified is that an elder is supposed to be a husband of one wife and irreprehensible. And if there's allegations against a person for lying or cheating or whatever it was, then they may not qualify to serve. Well, this man had allegations against him for years, and they knew that he was involved in a homosexual incident in the Bethel headquarters. And apparently additional information had come to the attention of the body of elders.
There's no kind of comparison being drawn here between getting involved in homosexual incidents and molestation. But
and I'm glad you mentioned that because obviously, we are supporters of persons of all, of the LGBT community 100%, and there's no connection between that and pedophilia. But there's a sort of a borderline thing that happened with Watkins because it was a new young Bethelite that happened, and the sexual, what I would call the sexual assault that occurred at Bethel, he claims is consensual. So we think that maybe he was withholding information about what really happened in the Bethel headquarters back in the late 1980s up until 1988 when he was dismissed. Mind you, this is interesting because he had only been married for about 2.5 years when he's having homosexual relationships with one or more individuals allegedly at Brooklyn Bethel, and was dismissed for being caught. Well, generally, if you're caught doing something, it's not the first time. And they even asked him, the prosecutor, when it came down to Watkins testifying, and yes, he, against advice of counsel, he testified in his own defense, which was a big, big, big mistake. And that ended up just ripping the courtroom to shreds. And he was ripped to shreds by Mr. Eric Hance, who is a elected prosecutor from Independence County, Arkansaw. This is a man that you do not want to go up against. He ripped Watkins to shreds. And he asked him straight out, are you a homosexual? Are you a bisexual? Are you heterosexual? And Watkins said, no, I put all that behind me in the past. I'm not a homosexual. We don't believe in that as Jehovah's Witnesses. And it was just so bizarre to hear him say that after having, you don't just have these feelings and these homosexual experiences and then spend the rest of your life saying you're not homosexual. But unfortunately, in his case, he could not admit to what he really was, aside from being a pedophile, which is a whole separate issue. So it was very disturbing. Now, his wife testified in his defense, and they questioned her on the actions that took place back in the 1980s at Bethel, which got both of them kicked out. And she said, that interestingly enough, she didn't have to bring this up, but she said, I can't get a scriptural divorce. I couldn't get a scriptural divorce because of what happened. And I really don't know exactly her point in saying it. The detective believes that she was trying to say that she wanted a divorce but couldn't get away from him because of Watchtower's policy. And the policy was such that whatever he did, he downplayed it so that it wasn't fornication. So he had a homosexual experience, but it wasn't fornication. And I know, Owen, this sounds really kind of creepy to you because it's JW terminology.
Right. No, let me just kind of sum it up here, and you tell me if I'm right with this. There are 3 reasons for separation, marriage separation, and only 1 reason for divorce with Jehovah's Witnesses, right? The reason for divorce is fornication, which means sexual relations outside of the marriage. The 3 reasons, I think, are physical abuse, spiritual non-support, or physical non-support, right? So how is it that they didn't qualify for a divorce? I mean, that's a clear-cut case of fornication, right?
Well, no, it apparently it wasn't. It may have been a clear-cut case for a possible separation for maybe absolute spiritual endangerment or some other. But she made the point that she couldn't get a divorce, and she ended up spending the rest of her marriage, rest of her life with this man. And she was living with not only a gay man, but she was living with a person who was mentally sick, who decided to take his sexual urges out on children using his power and authority as a Jehovah's Witness elder. I mean, it's really unusual for a person to get kicked out of Bethel and to be appointed as an elder within a few years and assigned to live inside of a congregation where you have access to all of these boys. These people in Indiana and in Arkansas were throwing their kids at him. He would actually study with them inside of the Kingdom Hall after the wife was kicked out or asked to leave, or she voluntarily left. We don't know. We do have some information that I'm not going to go into in great detail, but he had Bible studies with dozens and dozens of young boys, and he actually produced documentation where he would ask these kids on a questionnaire things like, what would you do if you weren't one of Jehovah's Witnesses? And the kids would have to fill these questionnaires out. And I've seen them with, they would have to write the answers. Things like, what are your doubts about the religion? And you could tell that this was the makings of a predator, a pedophile who was grooming these young people, these young men, and later young women. He was virtually an equal opportunity offender who sexually molested both boys and girls, all minors. That came out at trial. Multiple young women testified, multiple young men testified. But yes, his wife stayed with him the whole time, moving from state to state. They pioneered. He rose in rank as a congregation elder, had all of these assembly overseer privileges, public talks in the assembly, and he would pick up these children. For example, it came out at trial that he would pick up these children, such as a young woman, 9 or 10 years of age. The parents were like, no problem, take her to the meeting. He would give a talk in another congregation. Maybe it was Mountain View or Heber Springs or another area. In one case, he picked up a young woman, and it was just the two of them, which, of course, he abused children both in a public setting with other people and in private. He picked up this young woman and was driving her to the Kingdom Hall on the way to give a talk, and pulled up her dress and sexually molested her without even taking his eyes off the road. And I'm not going to go into any more graphic detail than that, because it was horrific. And they all were
like he delighted in doing stuff in public. That seemed to be his major thing that he derived sexual gratification from. And look, if you want to do stuff in public, that's fine. But what we're dealing with here is lives that are being ruined for one individual's sexual gratification. It really is sickening. I don't know whether you had any more to add on that, Mark. I'm just mindful of the fact that you have some photographs to show as well. Did you want to finish your point?
Yeah. And so there's just so much to unpack and discuss, and I really want to get into all the graphic details, because it really doesn't benefit the discussion too much, other than to say that this was an individual that the jury believed the victims. And maybe I'll mention this. Let me talk about the defense, because his defense attorney, Mr. Matthew McKay, was a attorney, I think, from Little Rock. I mean, his defense, let me back up and say that the state of Arkansas offered him a 40-year sentence prior to trial. And then, right before the trial started, while I was in the air flying 2 different flights to get to Arkansas, the state offered him their final offer, 30 years, which he could have served 1/6 of that according to Arkansas's law. They have a certain formula where if you follow all of the procedures, take all of the classes, you have to fully admit to your guilt, fully admit to being a child molester and your crimes, get help, take all the classes, and then potentially, if the parole board says that you qualify and there's no other roadblocks to that, then you could potentially get out in 1/6 of your sentence. So if they had sentenced him to 60 years, the prosecutor made the point that he could have gotten out in just 10 years, right? So they offered him 40. Then as a last-ditch offer, by Monday and Tuesday, they said 30 years is our best offer. And if you take that offer, you can save these victims and their families the horrific grief of having to get on that witness stand in front of all of their peers in the congregation, in front of each other, the judge, the prosecutors, myself, and there was very few other people in the courtroom. Outside of that, there were no journalists there. But you can save these people. You can admit what you did, save them the grief of having to go through this, relive this horrific experience, and just take the 30 years, admit to what you did. And he said, no, I'm going to trial. His attorney went on the record with the judge in private twice. His attorney went on the record twice and said, take the deal. He advised him strongly to take the deal. And instead he said, no, I'm going to trial. I can prove my innocence. He denied all charges. He said it didn't happen. His exact words. When he finally took the stand at the end, it was it was horrific, guys. It was, the prosecutor just ripped him apart. And actually at one point he screamed at Watkins and told him to stand up and face these people and tell them, give me a reason why. Why would they be lying? Why are they doing this to you? Why are they making these accusations against you? You haven't given me anything. You haven't given this court a single reason why they would do this. What is the reason? Do they have an axe to grind against you? And he shouted and said, stand up. So Watkins stood up, and he had a little long, skinny gooseneck mic, and he bent over and he faced this. Now, mind you, all of the Jehovah's Witnesses victims and their family members, they were all on the left side. So you had, probably 50 to 60 people on the left side. I was on the right side, sitting directly behind Becky Watkins and her sister. And I was maybe 10 feet from Rod Watkins and his attorney. So most of the people were on the one side. He stood up, faced them, bent over this little skinny mic, and said, if I have offended you in any way, I am sorry, but it didn't happen. He admitted nothing. He absolutely...
To the bitter end.
It sounds like the kind of brazenness and narcissism that fueled his abuse spree was also on display in his delusional belief that he could somehow avoid justice just by a show of bravado on the stand. Incredible. Owen, when we first discussed this case, I know Mark referred earlier to the fact that all of this abuse has happened in the 21st century, and I think, Mark, you said most of the victims are still minors. And that was what most shocked me when I first came to hear of this story. I'm going to say it was around, I think it might have been May or June that we covered this on Watchtower Focus. And the point I'm getting at, Owen, is that usually when we think of child sex abuse in a Jehovah's Witness context, we almost like to think of it as having happened maybe decades ago, maybe in the 80s or 90s, because that's when many of these cases happen. Yeah. Do you kind of share my horror that we're now at a point where we're getting stories like this, where the victims are actually still kids?
It's extremely disturbing. But if it shows one thing, it's that the policies still need to be changed, that there are still issues within the religion that are kind of allowing this type of thing to slip through the cracks. I actually did read the article on JW Survey this morning about it, and I would recommend anybody go read that if you haven't yet. It's extremely informative, but needless to say, there are a lot of issues with the policies in the religion that allowed this to continue for as long as it has. So I'm really hoping that we can hammer away at this, continue hammering away at this, and not let the Watchtower Society get away with claiming that they've fixed the issues and that this is old news and all that other stuff, because obviously it's not. Obviously it is not fixed. And on that note, I was actually wondering if you could tell me, was the Watchtower Society involved in any of the defense in any way, or did they just kind of just walk away from that whole situation? He had his own lawyer for all of this?
Correct. He had Mr. Matthew McKay. I don't think Watchtower would touch this with a 10-foot pole or longer. What I can say is that this case is far from over, because like many abuse cases, you have the crime itself, and here we have justice served upon a man who we think abused dozens and dozens of victims. At least 10 have already spoken to the police, but there's other states, other accusations that I'm not even going to get into at this point, because this man was a serial pedophile that used his position of authority as an elder, as a highly respected elder and fantastic public speaker, to control or have access to children in a way that he knew those parents would trust him. And I will say this, that he had access in particular to fatherless boys who either didn't have a Jehovah's Witness father or who didn't have a father, period, in their life. And these people identified, the congregation members themselves identified Rod Watkins as a man who would go and look after these because he was such a respected elder. He took these kids on camping trips, on fishing trips. all over the place. He would take these kids, he would take them driving with them, sexually assault them in vehicles, on camping trips. One individual, and I have to say, you know, a couple of the victims have reached out to me in 2 different states, and I've got firsthand knowledge and reports of exactly what happened. And I'm not going to go into all the details, and certainly not going to go into any names, but also their family members have reached out to me, and they all tell shockingly the same story. Everything that you read about what happened in Arkansas is exactly what happened in Indiana. And my fear is that it began long before that in Brooklyn, Bethel, and there were even things that happened back in North Carolina. It's a pattern of behavior of a sick individual who was enabled by this organization because of this 2-witness rule and because of their lack of reporting. Watkins got on the stand himself and shockingly said, when they were discussing mandatory reporting, they asked him, you know, if he knew what mandatory reporting was, and he said Arkansas is not a mandatory reporting state.
So he knew very well.
But it is a mandatory reporting state. So this is what I'm getting at. So here's a man who is a serial pedophile on the witness stand, sentenced to 80 years. He'll never see the light of day again. He says Arkansas is not a reporting state. Well, he's wrong and right. He's absolutely wrong. It is a mandatory reporting state for clergy. But this is what we've been talking about in Watchtower in Focus and in our articles for years now. Watchtower uses the clergy penitent exception, and they broaden the definition of what it means to, what does the term confidentiality mean? Watchtower says, or the law says, that if something is within the realm of confidentiality, then it might be considered clergy penitent privilege, although the law was designed to be between a priest or an elder and a penitent individual. So if a penitent individual goes to his pastor or his priest and says, you know, I have stolen something and it's bothering my conscience and I need to tell someone. So that is what is originally the law designed to be clergy penitent privilege, where the priest is not permitted to or shouldn't disclose that confession. But we're not talking about the confessions here. We're talking about the victims coming forward to the elders, the parents coming forward to the elders, other individuals, other people coming forward, and all of these people know about it. The congregation elders know it. Another congregation elders know it. Watchtower's elders and legal department know about it in New York. And then on top of that, you have individuals who may or may not be warned in the congregation if Watchtower determines that a person is a known pedophile. So once Watchtower makes that determination that a person is what they call a known pedophile, elders are allowed at their discretion to tell other family members who have young children that there may be a pedophile, or that there is a pedophile in their midst, and that they mention that person's name. So what I'm saying is that wipes out the whole idea of confidentiality. There is no longer any clergy penitent privilege there because it's not confidential. But here's Rod Watkins on the witness stand saying Arkansas is not a reporting state. So I spoke to the law enforcement, you know, the person who arrested Watkins and did all the research on this case. And she felt the same way, that, you know, what he was trying to say was that it's a reporting state, except we have this clergy penitent exception, and we're going to claim that exception like they do in Maryland and New York, California, and every other state. We have a real problem with our legislation in the way that language is worded, and Watchtower is trying to evade the reporting commission they have, the reporting obligation, by claiming clergy penitent privilege. And it's just shocking. It's horrible. And the police officer who arrested him told me it is just so, she was so mad that these elders had done this because they have no training in how to debrief a victim. It is extremely serious. They have to do very minimal amounts of interviews with the victims. And yet in this case, I was advised that the elders had actually made these victims confront Rod Watkins with the allegations. Now, these kids are already traumatized.
Even though they're not supposed to, according to the current rule book.
Yeah, and I forget which year that changed. Maybe somebody can comment on that. But obviously, these things took place over a course of many years, and they did change that rule where a victim doesn't necessarily have to, if it's a minor victim, doesn't have to confront. But in this case, with Watkins' case, that's what law enforcement told me, was that when she interviewed these people, that many of those victims were forced to confront Watkins. So they're already traumatized. He's already the most powerful elder. Everyone has told me that, not just one person. Everyone I've spoken to that knows him from multiple states, that he was the most charismatic, powerful elder in the circuit. They were afraid of him. In one case, and probably more, but in one case, a young man testified that Watkins threatened to harm or kill his dog and destroy his electronic toys. He made multiple threats to this child if he told. That is the pattern and MO of a child sexual abuse predator, and a very, very sick
pattern and MO of a psychopath, quite frankly.
Yeah. Yes.
Who threatens to damage animals.
Well, if anyone's ever seen the Keepers documentary, which is actually filmed right here in Baltimore, that was exactly what happened with this Catholic priest, where he took his victims to a wooded area and said, I'll kill you and bury you if you tell anyone what happened. And this is what Watkins was doing. But what I started to get to earlier was that his MO is he knew exactly what line not to cross to get away with it. And he thought he was going to get away with it forever. In other words, he didn't grab a kid, pin him down, and penetrate him anally or otherwise. He didn't do that. He would slip his hand down their pants or inside of one of the under the blanket. I mean, he would do this with a small congregation gathering with a blanket over a young girl and would sexually molest these kids in full view while watching a movie, and actually turned his heat down so that the apartment was cold so that they would have to use a blanket. And he had these girls just jumping in his lap. I mean, my God, it was so horrific, especially the one young man who was just a wonderful kid that grew up. Everyone described him as just extremely affectionate, very affectionate kid whose life was ruined because Watkins used that affection against that kid and sexually molested him on probably hundreds of occasions, because the kid was with him all the time, hundreds of occasions, and destroyed their trust. So by the time it gets to the police officer, as she pointed out to me, these kids already don't trust adults. And it's just infuriating to law enforcement when these elders get involved and interview these children and take them to the perpetrator or just interview them internally. It is horrific. By the time police ever get to know, it's just they don't know what to do because these kids are traumatized. They don't trust adults, and they also don't tell them everything at first. They tell them a little bit about what happened. And it's not until the second or third interview, which they don't like to do multiple interviews, but it's not until the second or third that they finally start getting more and more what happens. But they have to develop this trust with the child, which has already been completely wiped out by this abuser.
Right. It seems fairly clear to me that the Watchtower Society's rules and things like that allowed this to continue for as long as it had. I mean, we all share that sentiment, right? If we could get the rules changed for the Watchtower Society or for Jehovah's Witnesses, then it may not have gone on for this long. I'm wondering if you foresee any chance of somebody going after the Watchtower Society for this situation. Maybe we can pursue something. I know you said that only one of the survivors was an ex-Jehovah's Witness. And honestly, I think you'd probably be
one
committing
who testified. Only one who testified.
So there were others, though, possibly, who may pursue this, you think?
Yes.
I hate to press you on this, Mark, but that was a comment that came up from Truth Seeker Atheist. I mean, the obvious question here, and I understand that you may be a little bit tight-lipped, but we have to ask the question, is Watchtower going to be held accountable for what happened to these kids?
So I can't tell you what the outcome's going to be, but I can tell you, look at the other cases involving Watchtower in the cover-up of abuse. So here's the question we need to ask, and you guys can, the public can figure this out for themselves. Number one, are there additional victims who are willing to come forward? I know that the answer is yes. Number two, what did Watchtower know and when did they know it? What did the elders know and when did they know it? Whom did they inform or not inform? Let me give you a perfect example of something that happened during trial that was just heartbreaking. The first young man who is now no longer a witness, and he left because the elders didn't handle this abuse. The first young man who's doing well now. His mother was in the courtroom, testified, and halfway through the trial, a revelation came up. Now, we know that he was ejected from Brooklyn Bethel for touching a 20 or 21. He admittedly touched a 20 or 21-year-old young Bethelite on a camping trip, and he claims that it was consensual. Okay. We know that that happened. We know that the elders knew about it because that came out at trial. And what happened was the mother of this young man, when they revealed that the local Heber Springs congregation elders fully knew that this young man, that Rod Watkins had sexually touched another young man at Brooklyn Bethel, she got up and was bawling her eyes out and ran out of the courtroom, and another witness from the congregation followed behind, and the detective was there as well. And what had happened was that was the first time she realized that the local elders knew that this man, whether he claims it's consensual or not, that was the first time she ever knew that this man had touched other young men all the way back in 1988, if not earlier. Her son was not to be abused for over a decade later, maybe 15 years later, mid-2000s. It was so upsetting. I don't know what's going to come of that. She's an active witness now, but the revelation that they knew. So this is to answer your question. It's what did they know and when did they know it? Did they do anything to protect? For example, appointing him as an elder within a couple of years after being dismissed from Bethel for touching someone. And then he's an elder and he's assigned all of this responsibility. And then he ends up going to Arkansaw and getting even more responsibility from the year 2000 to when he was deleted as an elder in 2017. Now, going back to earlier, we think that there were some things that came out at trial that related to more information about what happened at Brooklyn Bethel. And that was part of the reason that he was deleted as an elder. But the other reason was that a woman in Indiana made a phone call in 2017 after a young man in Indiana had a major breakdown with his mom. And it was the first time in his life that he revealed that he had been sexually molested by Roderick Watkins. He had never revealed that before. He had severe psychological trauma and issues his entire life and marriage. He married a non-Jehovah's Witness, but his sister was a witness. His sister was the one that made the phone call to the elders and actually she called Rod Watkins directly and he wouldn't get on the phone. He was there. He wouldn't get on the phone, but his wife denied the allegations, screamed at her and said, I'm reporting this to the elders for slander, knowing full well that he did do this. So what did they know? When did they know it? So that's really what a lot of these cases hinge on. So whether or not there's going to be an official civil suit, well, I'm not going to get into, private details right now, but I can tell you that, if anyone out there has any knowledge or information about this man, normally I would say contact the Heber Springs police, but their investigation into Rod Watkins is complete. He's now sentenced to 80 years, and that's done. However, still give them the information, because there are those who are complicit in the cover-up of these crimes. Allegedly, his wife was complicit in the cover-up of these crimes, and I have to use that word allegedly because she's not been arrested, but allegedly complicit in the cover-up of the crimes. But not only that, the organization itself is complicit, because they knew that this man, they knew he was a predator, and that allegations against him, and they didn't even accept 2 witnesses in this case. It took at least 3 or 4 witnesses to come forward before anything was done. It was at least 3 witnesses before they ultimately disfellowshipped him in 2018. And here's the defense. I think people out there are probably asking, what kind of defense could be possibly put on to you've got 7 victims who've come forward to testify what he did to them, and they all tell the same story. Well, that was basically the defense, that they all told the same story. So the defense was he was disfellowshipped in 2018, and all of a sudden these allegations came forward. They didn't come forward before then, although they actually did. They just didn't do anything about them. They didn't have this. They didn't apply their 2-witness rule. So they didn't disfellowship until they had overwhelming evidence that he was a known child sex offender. And then they disfellowshipped him for that. And actually the charge was brazen conduct. And on the witness stand, he got nervous, and he couldn't even, he was mixing up whether or not it was brazen conduct that led to his removal as elder, or whether it led to his disfellowshipping in 2018. He got nervous. Here's a man who's a public speaker who was just known around the circuit, and he was getting nervous on the stand. He was forgetting scriptures, and, it was all breaking down. So he was disfellowshipped in 2018. Then the mother of a young man who's still very much a minor, she was the one who contacted, finally. It wasn't, and I think her husband's an elder, but he didn't contact the authorities at all. It was the wife who contacted the detective and said, this is what happened this is what my son said. And then she said, I think you might want to talk to this other young man, who is the young man that was at the football stadium, who was sexually assaulted by Watkins, who had mentioned this well before, who had already told the elders about this. So the detective started putting all the pieces together. She's got this woman and her son. Then she's got this other young man who had come forward several years before. And then members of the congregation started talking to each other, and they all kind of shared, realizing that, oh my God, my kids had the same experience. Your kids had the same experience. So the defense came on and said, well, these kids were all colluding. In fact, I've got some notes here. This is so horrific. I'll try to read you just a couple of things that I thought were outstanding, and there's going to be a lot more in the article. But the defense claimed, first of all, he said, look, we're not here to defend acts of sexual assault. He said, we're here to ensure that the burden of proof of the state is met. This is what the defense attorney said. He said, Watkins is a religious man. He mentored children. He was affectionate with them. We don't deny that, in very physical ways. He was a grandfather to these people. And then he said, well, for years, these children were affectionate. Mr. Watkins was affectionate with these children, and they never came forward. That was his defense. And he said that he said it was all about the timing of the first accusation, that all of this happened only after Watkins was disfellowshipped in 2018. And then he said, children talk among themselves. The accusations sound like coordinated stories. I'm not kidding you when I say that he said the accusations sound like coordinated stories, that these young minor children all colluded together. And he said that's very odd for a sexual assault case. You know, children.
That sounds to me like he was using his opportunity to re-victimize the victims who were there in court.
That's exactly what it was. And I mean, shame on the attorney, but I mean, he thinks he's doing his job, but he's re-victimizing these victims, saying that they colluded with each other. And he said, children talk amongst themselves and they get confused. And he actually said, at one point, he said, the memory is not a recording device. So that's when the whole issue.
The jury are all going to go, oh, fantastic point. What are we all doing here? You know, case closed or whatever.
It's the best defense that they could even come up with. Honestly, there is no defense to this whole situation.
Not when you have witness after witness parading in front of the entire courtroom and telling all the same story. And the only thing the defense can say is they colluded. They were all in on it together. These young minor children, they were all in on it. They talk amongst themselves. And by the way, memory fades and you can invent memories. In fact, they even questioned the jury ahead of time before they picked the final jury. And they had asked the jury whether or not the jury agreed that children can sometimes invent things that didn't happen. I'm not kidding you. One of the jurors said, this is one of the potential jurors before they made the final pick. That juror said, because she was asked, are there any times when your son made up a story? And she said, well, yeah, one time my son, my very young son, made up a story about how he went bear hunting and he killed bears. And that was a made up story. So children have wild and vivid imaginations. Of course they do. They make up stories about,
But not on this subject.
Not on this subject. Exactly, Lloyd.
Especially so many of them like that.
Yeah.
It's too, and the jury didn't buy it one bit.
Mark, I know that you took a lot of photos, but I'm also mindful of the fact that we've been talking now for just over an hour, and we do have another big story. So unless there's like a photograph that you absolutely would like us to all to see, maybe if we skip the photos, and because I know you have a JW survey article coming up on this.
Right.
So the other big story that is really we really do need to discuss in this context is that the United States Supreme Court has thrown out Watchtower's bid for the right to keep confidential sex abuse records. Now, this is breaking news. We've only heard about it, I think, in the last 12 hours. So what can you tell us, Mark?
Well, the case is one that we've reported on JW's survey, and there is an article up about it, and it's part one of this Supreme Court appeal in the JW versus Watchtower case. So this is a California civil case, not a criminal case. However, it was already handled criminally, much like the conviction of Rod Watkins. So I mentioned this on a previous episode. I'd recommend that anyone get a copy of this book, which is The Humanity of Justice by Burke Strunsky. This book was written by the prosecutor who brought this former Jehovah's Witness elder to trial in California. And now he's serving his prison sentence for multiple not allegations, but multiple convictions on child sexual abuse. This is a case where Watchtower intentionally obstructed justice and refused to turn over the elder's notes regarding the confession of sexual assault that occurred on multiple occasions, including one swim party that took place in which I think 3 of the 4 girls were sexually molested, both in the swimming pool and later that night in their beds during a slumber party. So this man, he writes an entire chapter of his book, Burke Strunsky, regarding this Jehovah's Witness case, JW versus Watchtower. Now, he writes this book before it ever goes to a civil case. So he's writing about the criminal aspect of it and how Watchtower failed to comply. And in fact, he had to prove that the communication was not confidential by discovering a Watchtower letter or a Watchtower edict that says that the elders can share information with another judicial committee. So that proved that there was no confidentiality or clergy penitent privilege in this case. And so the judge allowed that testimony, which ended up convicting and putting this man in prison probably for the rest of his life. I forget the sentence. It might be in my article. But so what happened was that case then, like the Watkins case could be, that case turned into a civil suit filed by the Zalkin law firm and another law firm initially called JW versus Watchtower. And Watchtower lost that case in the California trial court. And then they brought it to a higher court and an appellate court, multiple appeals. Watchtower lost every single time. And they finally brought it to the United States Supreme Court. And they made all sorts of claims, which we don't have time to get into right now. We've talked about it in previous episodes and in the article. But they brought it to the U.S. Supreme Court, who only accepts a fraction of the cases that's been delivered to them. But they were trying to argue that they didn't get a fair shake in this case, and that they shouldn't have had to turn over these private documents, these sealed documents that have to do with child molestation. So just as a reminder to our audience, Watchtower lost what's called a default judgment. So the judge ruled against Watchtower because they failed to comply with that whole discovery process. They didn't want to turn over the documents again and again and again, like they do in all the other cases. In this case, the judge ruled against them and awarded a $4 million verdict to the victim in this case, whose initials are JW. So that's sort of, I don't want anybody to get confused.
Yeah,
it's a total coincidence. The appeal has officially been not accepted by the United States Supreme Court. So I would like
to... So it's over for that then?
It is,
like they can't go any further. They have no recourse from here, right?
I've been in touch with the attorneys, and I have two things for everybody today. Two things. The first is I don't have an official statement from the attorney other than to say that Watchtower's done in this case. Now, I've heard some people say something along the lines of, now Watchtower has to turn over the documents. That is not correct at all. That is not what this case is about. That is a portion of the case, but the ruling means that Watchtower has to pay the judgment. And by the way, Watchtower has been paying a $6 million bond for years now, because they lost the case and they had to go to Travelers Insurance Company and purchase a bond to secure the payment in case Watchtower goes out of business. This is how these cases all work. In the Montana case, they're paying well over a $40 million bond on a $35 million judgment. In the JW versus Watchtower case, Watchtower's paying more than a $6 million bond. They are going to have to pay that money, whatever amount it is, between $4 and $6 million, unless it's exceeded $6 million, because they have to pay interest, because effectively they owe that money to the plaintiff. The plaintiff is a young lady in California, and I have spoken to her. Her mom has reached out to me. And so at this time, I just minutes before we went online, I received a public statement from the family of JW, and it's brief, but I would like to read it. This is a very important case.
Please do.
After years of battle, where we as survivors were challenged every step of the way, even to the highest court possible, we are thrilled with this outcome that will not only help with our recovery, but set precedent for the thousands of cases pending now and in the future. And that's from the family of the survivor in that case, JW, who was one of the victims, along with several other young girls that were molested by this former Jehovah's Witness elder. So Watchtower is done in that case. No further appeals.
And very, very glad to hear that. However, this is something, and this is what we were saying when we covered this story in our JW versus Watchtower episode, is that we said at the time, I think, whatever happens here, Watchtower has forever stained their once proud history of being at the forefront of fighting for civil rights at the US Supreme Court, because that proud legacy, which is arguably one of the very few things people can point to when it comes to looking for positives in the Jehovah's Witness religion, they used to be able to say, oh, well, at least many of the religious rights that we have today were won by the Jehovah's Witnesses when fighting against compulsory flag salute and that kind of thing. They have thrown that proud legacy completely out of the window by shaming the organization, by going in front of the United States Supreme Court and saying, we think that all religions in the United States should have a right to keep secret child sex abuse records. And that's going to hang around their necks now forever, or at least we should make sure it hangs around their necks forever.
You bring up a great point, Lloyd, and I would like to give a shout out to your website, JW Survey, that you started, I think, was it 2012 or 2011?
2011, yeah.
Yeah. So, journalism matters and hard work pays off. And I want to give an example of that in this Arkansaw case, because without an avenue to get this out to the public, victims don't come forward. And we know this from the Catholic Church abuse cases that ended up, they made a movie, Spotlight, about what happened up in Boston with the uncovering up to the years 2002 or so. And there's a lot of work before that. But in the case of the Jehovah's Witnesses in state of Arkansas versus Roderick Watkins, the work that we've done has actually helped their investigation, and they've told me as much. In fact, the prosecutors told me that they had read my article. They're very aware of what is going on. At the beginning of the trial, no less than 4 different times, both attorneys asked the jury, particularly the defense attorney, asked the jury on multiple occasions, have you read the social media posts on Facebook and elsewhere about this case? And I think most people will recognize now that there hasn't been media coverage on this yet, and there will be, but the only posts have been my post or people that have shared my post or the JW Survey article. And then the judge jumped in and said, has anyone read these posts on social media? Because they would have excluded the jurors who, if they had been influenced by these posts in any way. So the reason they brought this up was that they became aware that I had been posting about this case and had written an article about this case. And here's what happened. So a woman, I'll just give her a first name. Her name is Linda. She lived in this apartment complex. It's a small apartment community. Maybe there's about 15 or 20 units, all in a big semicircle. And this is where Roderick Watkins lived for years. His wife was the property manager of this Heber Springs community. It's a low-income community. She was the property manager, had keys to all of the places in there. They lived in a special building right in the center of the community, right above the entertainment room, laundry room. They had access to it. People were coming and going all the time. JWs were having parties there. Watkins was seen with kids there all the time. And here's what happened. A woman who lives in that community at number 9, it faces number 11. They're directly across, the doors are directly across from each other. Now, Watkins lived at 13, but he was the maintenance man. So he did painting and repairs at all of these properties. He was over at number 11 painting this house. The door was open, and he had the same young man with him that was with him all the time. It was a young boy that he molested on dozens and dozens of occasions. The neighbor at 9, who was just literally 4 to 6 feet away. Her door just faces number 11. She saw Watkins in there with this young man, rubbing all up and down his back, grabbing him around the waist, tickling him, just doing all sorts of things that she felt was inappropriate. But she didn't know anything was up because she saw him with this kid all the time. She thought, well, maybe he's his grandson or his son or some nephew. She didn't really, she saw this going on a couple of years ago, right? So what happened was several months ago, there's a Heber Springs Facebook page. It's called Heber Springs News, something along those lines. Some other person had posted the JW Survey article to this Facebook group. This woman is part of that Facebook group. She goes on there and sees Roderick Watkins and his allegations. He was out on bail at that time, $100,000 bail. She sees that he was accused of this sexual abuse of multiple minors. And she says, oh my God, I saw Watkins with this young man. And what I saw was very inappropriate. I'm going to contact the police. So the phone number was right. I think the detective's name is right in my survey article. She contacted the detective. They brought this woman in to interview her. Then they subpoenaed her to testify. The defense tried to get it thrown out. So at the beginning of this trial last week, on Wednesday, they brought her in without the jury present, and they made her they asked her to give her testimony to what she saw. The judge then said, well, if you can't identify the boy, we can't use your testimony. So the police detective got to work, and she interviewed the woman and got him later in private chambers. She got him to describe the boy. So she gives an accurate description of the boy, but did not know his name. So then she brought the boy. They brought this woman, Linda, into the room where they had other victims who were going to testify, and asked her to basically pick him out of a lineup, pick him out of the room. And she immediately identified this young man. At that point, the judge said, I will accept your testimony. They brought her back into the court, brought the jury in, and she gave her testimony as to what she saw. And they used that as part of the testimony to convict Roderick Watkins and sentence him to 80 years in life. So look, anybody out there who thinks that journalism doesn't matter, bringing these things to light doesn't matter, please study up on that, read up on that, because even the small work that we do has resulted in two things in this case. Number one, it provided another witness who testified against Watkins and helped put him away for what he did, for his crimes. And number two, that article has drawn out multiple additional family members and victims who are from other states and other places who have like and similar complaints against Watkins. So this case is far from over. And as Owen, you brought out earlier, you asked that question about, is there going to be a civil case?
Yeah.
So, all I can tell you is that that's on the table at this point, because these elders knew, they covered it up, they didn't call the police. And even Watkins himself said, oh, no, clergy privilege, they don't have a reporting statute in Arkansas. It's almost as if he knew what he could get away with. And when they put him on the witness stand and that prosecutor ripped him to shreds, he said, you abused your authority. And he said, you knew that you could get a free pass. Those are his exact words. He said, you could get a free pass by continuing your behavior because of what this organization or your position in the organization allowed you to get away with. And I think that sent a powerful message to the jury, and the jury did the right thing and gave him 80 years to think about it.
It's extremely good news.
Indeed.
And it's sad.
Guys, we've been going for 90 minutes now, and even though clearly we're not boring people, because there's currently around 900 people watching, which is fantastic. Thank you to all of you for tuning in, and I'm sorry I've not been able to read your comments, but hopefully you've seen I've been able to show at least some of them on the screen, and we really do appreciate the messages of solidarity and kindness that have been coming through, particularly for the survivors who have finally brought this monster to justice and may well bring Watchtower to justice. We'll have to wait and see. But I'm wondering whether we can advance towards the end with perhaps our usual summary, because obviously Covert Fade isn't here to give a masterclass on perfect news reading, but we can at least do our summary. So, Owen, I'm wondering whether you can share your thoughts, having listened to what Mark's got to say and ruminated on this story.
Yeah, I can do that. I think monsters like this exist in society. You find this in more than just the Jehovah's Witness community, but the issue that we're dealing with here that makes this a unique situation and one that's really seriously worthy of scrutiny is the fact that the Watchtower Society contributed in some ways to, or enabled, I guess you could say, enabled this guy to continue offending longer than he otherwise would have. There are more victims, more survivors than there may have been if the Watchtower Society hadn't thought that putting out a Caleb and Sophia video would stop this kind of thing, instead of changing their policies and using common sense, instead of misapplying some biblical standard that wasn't even intended for criminal suits in the first place, or criminal cases in the first place. So my summary of this is I'm so glad that we get to see this guy go to prison for 80 years. I could not be happier about that, because society is being protected from him now. I'm so sad for the survivors of this case, but at the same time, so glad that they get to see justice out of this. And if there's one ray of sunshine or one ray of hope out of this situation, it's the fact that the Watchtower Society looks worse now than they did before for enabling this. And maybe we can get a civil suit against them, another civil suit against them for this type of situation.
Well said, Owen. Just to add my own, how do you say it, my own 5 cents, to use an American expression. I think we've covered two very
cents, Lloyd, that's 2 cents.
Yeah, 2 cents. I was thinking.
Sorry, 2 cents. Good grief, I'm getting the wrong amount here. And I mispronounced Arkansaw in our first episode on this.
Let me just give you, Lloyd, a little bit of a.
Yeah, he's even gone to the trouble. This is what I'm dealing with in my colleague here. He's even gone to the trouble at some point during the day of thinking, I know, I'm going to tease Lloyd. I'm going to print out a piece of paper that I can wave in front of the screen. Thank you for that, Mark. That's charming.
There's very little levity in what we're discussing, Lloyd, but there you go. That's our smile for the day.
Got to have a bit of banter. If you don't laugh, you'll cry. Yeah. But what I was going to say was that we've covered 2 very significant stories in this episode, albeit one we covered very briefly, which is the Supreme Court story. But they're both stories that should echo and resonate for decades to come when we're having this conversation about child sex abuse. Because as I mentioned earlier, in the Rod Watkins story, we learn that child sex abuse isn't just something that affected children in the distant past or in previous decades. All of these victims were from the 21st century, were abused in the 21st century, and the majority of them are still children. So this is how recent the victims are. And if there are victims who are still so young, you can bet that there are victims accumulating even now because of these policies, and particularly because of Watchtower's secrecy in keeping the child sex abuse database, in keeping actionable information that law enforcement can use to protect people, and withholding it. So that's the first thing. And then with the Supreme Court story, what we've learned, and what we should never let Watchtower ever forget, and what we should bring up with Jehovah's Witnesses when we're having this conversation is your religion appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States for their right to cover up child sex abuse. That's the significance of that story, and we should never let Watchtower forget it, in my humble submission. That's my 2 cents. So
You got it.
Well, Lloyd, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And, look, I've got a giant book of notes here from this that is way beyond what I could even go into, even in an article about the subject. It's a book, and it's a sad book. It's a sad story. And there's some things we just can't talk about. But, I want to say a couple of things that I find interesting. There are individuals who are realizing that this is very wrong, and that they have, in many cases, broken rank and reached out to JW Survey and our small support team and spoken to us inside of the organization in various capacities, and including active elders who have said, this is wrong. I was contacted by an elder this year, and I can't give any personal information away at all, because obviously this person is up against losing his family, his friends, and everything if it's revealed that this well-respected elder ran into a child abuse case within the past year and was told not to contact the authorities in a reporting state, in a mandatory clergy reporting state. And then he was later told to destroy the notes where they told him not to report. He was told to destroy the notes. And I'm just going to say that, without giving
Which
away...
is surely, that's a criminal act, to destroy criminal evidence.
Let me say that the law enforcement is looking into that incident and any others related to that. And I want to thank, you and our whole team, Sasha and Sherry and Chloe and Kimmy and our new legal representative as part of our team, Kim, Silvio, and Covert Fade, who couldn't be here today, unfortunately, because they're all putting in a tremendous amount of work and attention and effort into helping create a landing place, a safe landing place, where it doesn't matter if you're, a person of belief and faith, or an atheist, or anything in between, agnostic, whatever, a safe landing place where they know that we are going to do everything we can to get the truth out, not sensationalist. We're not here to, preach about Masonic pinky rings and conspiracy theories. We're here for the cold, hard facts and the truth, and we dissect that information and try to give it to the public. And because people trust us, I'm very proud of the fact that they trust our team enough to reach out to us, so much so that, the survivors in the JW case would even give us a personal statement to read to the public. And that law enforcement trusts us. The attorneys that are filing these cases trust us. And we want to continue that trust, protect these victims. And I just want to thank everybody that's reached out to us, because there are people breaking ranks. I want to say I went to the community where Rod Watkins lived. In fact, I spent my last day, which was Friday. I spent the whole day going around. I went to the Kingdom Hall where he served for almost 20 years. And I went to the community where he lived, just 500 feet or so away. And all of these neighbors came out and started talking to me voluntarily, just talking to me. Many of them knew Watkins for a long time. One person that I interviewed said there were children. He had a little boy with him at all times. It's the same story that I'm getting from multiple different sources, but they told stories about this man, this community, his behavior. All of it adds up to a person who was grooming children and was just a narcissistic pedophile that is a danger to the community and has ruined and ripped apart these lives. And I wish I could do something for the family members. I did help raise money for one of the kids that had the GoFundMe account. And thanks to my Facebook friends, they raised about $2,000 for some therapy for that young man. And I hope that helps. He seems to be doing better, but it's a long road to recovery. But what I wanted to get to on this was that even during the trial, those people in the audience saw me and immediately identified me as someone questionable to them. And I had people coming up to me questioning who I was. But one very nice witness spoke to me outside, who was really shocked at the cover-up of the child abuse that took place. And while she was speaking to me and two other attorneys that were standing there, one of the witnesses came up and just literally grabbed her and attempted to pull her away from speaking to me and said, "Those are all apostates." Me and the two attorneys, she said, "They're all apostates. You should not speak to them." And here I am. I've helped law enforcement get a witness to testify and put this man in prison because of my article. That helped them, and I helped them raise money. And I'm not mad at these people. I feel a tremendous amount of pity for them, but they simply don't understand that we are trying to help these victims. We're trying to create transparency to change laws. And they don't understand that, writing about it and talking to the media and just getting this out into the open is what's ultimately flushing this out and helping them. That's what helped the victims of the Catholic Church, the Boston Globe and Mike Resendiz and the whole Spotlight team. What they did, flushed it out into the open and created investigations. And because of that, because of journalism, and because of what you're doing here on Watchtower and Focus and your channel and everything else that we do, it's helping. And they don't understand that. They wouldn't even contact the media. There was no other media representative present in that courtroom. So, I've got to tell this story as best as I can with the information that I have. So I hope more people come forward. If you have something for law enforcement, please speak to law enforcement. If you have something for us about Roderick Watkins and his past in North Carolina, in Brooklyn, New York, in Sedalia, Missouri, or Kansas City, or Indiana, or Arkansas, please contact us at Survey with that information. And if it's anything, obviously the police need to know, contact law enforcement. But we're putting these pieces together because this case is far from over, and we're going to be seeing the effects of this case for a long time. So thank you guys for commenting and for, giving us a platform and supporting Lloyd's channel. And, Owen, thanks for the work that you do. I know we haven't had a chance to talk very much, but I know you're doing good work.
We'll get there. Yeah. I appreciate you having me on and involved in this, because this is an extremely important subject to me too, just as it is for you guys. So glad to be here.
I seem to have frozen. So am I frozen on your screens as well?
I can't see.
Okay, never mind. Well, anyway, I can at least communicate vocally. And I just want to thank you, Mark, for being there in Arkansas to report on this. It's been fascinating hearing what you have to say and particularly the emotional aspect of things and what this meant for the survivors to finally get justice. So I just want to thank the panel. Thank you, Owen, for making time in your schedule to share your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Viewers, although it's rather confusing to hear my disembodied voice in my salutary while I'm motionless, thank you so much to the nearly 900 who are watching right now, and to those of you who have tuned in at various points of the live stream to hear about this story. We really appreciate your interest and your messages of support. Don't forget to tune in and subscribe to the John Seethers channel for future episodes. And as always, thank you for watching.